familiar with peacekeeping and all. Now, with that little intro, today Sue is going to speak on the Holocaust. Please feel free after her presentation. The idea is that you speak for half an hour, 40 minutes, whatever you take, and then there will be an open question and answer Q&A. Use any language if you want. We can have it translated. If you want to ask questions in Bangla, is fine, and we'll have it translated. And then Professor Gronewold will also speak on the 16th, the public lecture on genocide in Asia at 4 p.m. At the Senate building. We want to record this. Would that be okay for you? Okay. One of the ideas that Center for Genocide does with some of the speakers, we record and we put them in the YouTube and all, in our websites, so that other students can, or other researchers can use, and they can also use it later on if they want to listen to you. And that's the reason you have been, that camera is looking at you. Anyway, with that little intro, please, it's all yours. So I'll be there at the back.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to do my thank yous to everybody here. It's a fairly long list because I'm delighted that Professor Ahmed made this introduction and invited me, learning about the Center for Genocide, for Holocaust Genocide Studies at my university. This trip was put together rather quickly, so I've had to prepare for it quickly. But it was done quickly, and the State Department and Calvin Hayes, is he here? There he is, yes, and Shaheen Khan, who's with the Fulbright Commission, were really helpful in putting together the trip at the last minute. So I want to thank them a lot. And also University of Dhaka, which I have today done some visiting and meeting people from the IR department. So I want to thank them for introducing me to the university and learning about it. I mean, this for me is really an educational trip. And it's not just me speaking to people, it's really me learning. So yes, I am sharing things that I have thought about with you, but I'm really self-interested. It's really for me to learn about Bangladesh. I know a bit about India. I know more about East Asia. Bangladesh is something I know a little bit about because there's a large Bangladeshi community in New Jersey. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a minute. But so I have, a passing knowledge about things in Bangladesh. But this trip is really one for me to. It's my first trip, and the first of many, I hope, and for me to really learn about it. I got into the study of genocide and Holocaust kind of through the back door. My own interest. I'm trained as an historian. My degree is a PhD in modern Chinese history from Columbia University in New York. And there I did work on women's issues, on the sale of women actually in the late 19th, early 20th century, the Republican period in Chinese history. And also work on transnational issues have done a lot of work on the connections between China and other places. Early on through the Silk Road, and we're now talking about reviving Silk Road, both maritime and actually people are talking about reviving Silk Road on land. So it becomes a kind of a nice metaphor to talk about China and the world. I also do a lot of work in world history, and so we now at my university, we have, in the United States, there are required first 2 years are mostly required courses in many universities. And in my university, the required history course is a world history course. And I run that program, and I think very strongly Americans tend not to know enough about the rest of the world. And so the training of American students in the rest of the world is very little. And I really hope to address a lot of that by requiring students. Every student at my university has to take this world history course. We have 2,000 students a year taking it. And I run that program and train teachers, and we talk about what the emphasis should be. One of the things that I do in my study of East Asia is I do work in public history, in training teachers, in taking what I know in the academy outside the academy. And I understand that's, you know, literally a description of other people around the table here, that you're not only in the academy, but you're also taking those ideas. It's a cross-fertilization between actually doing things outside the academy and with scholars. And so I'm very interested in kind of public history. So for a long time, I've taken students and teachers to Asia from the United States and to East Asia, to Southeast Asia. And on one trip in 2005, I went to China and with a colleague also took students to Japan. In 2005, we visited in central China. We visited the Nanjing Memorial Museum. There was in 1937 a rape of Nanjing, a massacre, as the Japanese took control of central China. And they behaved in ways that some call massacre, some call genocide. And then the same trip went across the sea to see how those same events were portrayed in Japan. And it was really a very different view, depending on which part of the sea you were in, how those events were viewed. And for the Japanese, they not only downplayed the massacre, but they also then spoke about themselves as victim. So it was understanding how the Japanese viewed themselves, and then went in Japan not only to their own shrine to martyrs in Japan, but also to the ground zero in Hiroshima, and where the Japanese have a museum to ground zero and to the residents of Hiroshima and what they experienced. And so that's also been considered by some to be a genocide. So that was really kind of my personal introduction to genocide. And then in 2009, Kean University in New Jersey is right in the middle of a large Bangladeshi community in New Jersey. And so many people on the staff are Bangladeshi and who are connected to people here in Dhaka, and so they put together a really unusual conference in 2009. I was chair of the history department, and so I was quite involved in putting together this conference. And the conference was one that had not only ambassadorial level diplomatic people, it had legal scholars, it had historians. There were all sorts of different kinds of people speaking, and in addition, one kind of unprecedented part of it for an academic conference was there was in a separate room, there was a poster session from the Liberation War Museum. And so we met yesterday, the same people I had met there, and they did presentations on the Liberation War Museum. And the other thing that they did was have a separate parallel series of discussions by people who gave testimonials. And so this was people from the community, older people from the community, who told their stories. And one of the things I'm going to be talking about is memorials and remembering, memory making. And so these were oftentimes, this happens, these were people who had never told their stories before. We had slotted, I think it was 2 hours we slotted for the testimonials. I think it went on 4 or 5 hours. It went on people for the first time. And there were people there, older people there with their children, who said that this was the first time they had told their stories. Particularly, and I know this is something that Liberation War Museum does, particularly the stories of women. And in fact, I told the people at Liberation War Museum 4 years ago when I met them, and then repeated it yesterday, that it's so unprecedented to have women's voices so acknowledged. women's voices, women always participate, but to have them acknowledged is really unusual, and the Liberation War Museum does that, and it was done at our conference, and women who told their stories of, often personal violation and things that were very personal, but told their stories, and, felt comfortable, felt that they could take the risk and tell their stories. So then with that experience, and it was an extraordinary conference with all these different voices, then I took a report of that conference. I was the chair of the history department. I did a report of that conference. Took it then the following year to a conference in Cambodia. And I was invited to be a part of a conference on Cambodia in world history. And I presented the conference that we had done at Kean on Bangladesh. And at that point, Cambodia was just on the beginning of talking about a tribunal. They were still at the very complicated step of actually doing a tribunal. But this conference was held in the shadow, literally the shadow of Angkor Wat, and began in Phnom Penh with visits to the sites, the actual killing sites, the memorial sites, the prison in Phnom Penh, where 20,000 of the most suspect people were brought. 7 people survived. So those people, several of those people actually are working still at this prison, which was a school turned into a prison. So I went to that site, went to the Killing Fields. There's a famous movie about Cambodia called The Killing Fields, and I went to those sites. These were all the reasons that I have been really thinking a lot about Holocaust, genocide, and we then developed at my university a master's program. So I understand that is the direction that this program is going to be going in. But we now have a master's program on Holocaust and genocide studies. And it's a growing program. It's an unprecedented program in the United States because I think there are only 3 like it. In that, and I have some, I didn't bring many of them, but I have some descriptions here of the course requirements. And you can actually see online. You go to Kean University to the Master of Holocaust Genocide Studies, and you will see there the course requirements and a kind of a profile of the program. For a number of reasons that I'll be talking about, what you have in Europe and the United States, when people talk about genocide, is the genocide which comes first, is Holocaust. And the argument is that the Holocaust, and the reason we don't refer to it, we don't talk about the Jewish genocide. It's never referred to in that way. It is always referred to in this special term, the Holocaust. And there are some people who use this term Holocaust to talk about Native Americans, to talk about other Holocausts, but the Jewish people who went through Holocaust in Europe really insist that this is a term for the Jewish Holocaust, which they insist is unique in world history. And because there is that very strong argument and that's very strong feeling, we have differentiated in our program between the Jewish Holocaust and other genocides. And so students in this program have a grounding, so their core program, the foundation courses, you will see on it, I'll just pass some of these around, but the foundation courses for our program are Holocaust courses. So there are just a few of them, so I'll get some more made. But the argument is that this was such an unprecedented event in world history that it needs to be privileged, it needs to be put front and center, and then all other genocides are kind of discussed after it, but first there needs to be a grounding in the Holocaust. Why is that argument made? And I know it's certainly around the world a contentious argument, controversial argument to make, and there are many people who would disagree with that, but the argument is that the Jewish Holocaust was, and you think about the definitions of Holocaust, some of the convention, the UN Convention in particular, that this is a mass killing which is different from others in that it was modern, using modern technologies. It's an industrial mass killing, that it's systematic, that it is an extensive attempt using modern technologies, modern propaganda, modern methods, to exterminate a whole people. And the argument is that Hitler basically had this plan, put it into action, and did it very systematically in an extraordinarily industrial. I mean, I think that's the key, is the scale, the intent of it, and the scale of it, and the industrial nature of it. So I want to talk with you about, those methods and the success of it. I mean, basically Hitler was successful. If you go to Eastern Europe, the Jewish villages that made up Poland, Poland or Russia, depending on the date, they're gone. That world is totally gone. It doesn't exist anymore. If you go to the cities in Germany, the great cities of Germany, I was in Vienna last year. Vienna doesn't have Jews anymore. Berlin doesn't have Jews anymore. The Jews are gone from Europe. Before the 1930s, 2/3 of the Jews in the world lived in Europe. Now about 1/3. There were 9 million Jews. 2/3 of Europe's Jews were killed in this systematic way by Hitler and his machine, his industrial machine. So I think those are some of the reasons why the Holocaust is privileged, seen as unique, the argument is, and then for a program like ours, and I think this would be true many places in Europe and in the United States, but particularly in the United States, South America maybe. Jews now don't live in Europe. The majority of Jews live outside of Europe. They live in the United States, North America, South America. Many were exiled in South America and in Israel. So the world has been lost. The world has changed. This happened in the 1930s, 1940s. There still is a great deal of scholarship of people we're learning about. In March of 2013, there was an article published, a study that was reported, an article published in the New York Times, which detailed the extent of this industrial machine that was established to get rid of Jews. And I understand that they're the same kind of chronicling of sites in Bangladesh, and I look forward to learning about that, geography of it, but also in Cambodia, also in China. There's an attempt to tell the story, but also look at it in terms of the geography of it. And this, so many years later, it still was a shock for people in the world, but in the place that experienced it, to find out that scholars doing a great deal of work in archives, probably also even using GPS and the kinds of things that people are doing in terms of being able to look at the geography of it, counted, the count is now 42,000 killing sites. And it's not just in Germany. Well, actually, the killing centers were not in Germany; they were in Poland mostly. But there were camps, there were extermination sites, there were labor camps, there were POW camps, there were sites for people who were disabled, etc. There were brothels. There were 500 brothels for women made available to German soldiers and other people. So the research continues in detailing this unique genocide in Western history, in world history. And I think the other thing that makes the argument that the Holocaust is unique is the the desire to exterminate people and the way that the going about it, the systematic way of going about it, was seen as something which is beyond human comprehension. You know, I think there's that sense that it was extraordinarily barbaric. You know, it's beyond what there are words for, beyond what there's language for, beyond what, and beyond the norms of what people should do to each other. So it's that ferocity, barbarity, and then the systematic nature of it, which explains why it's considered to be unique, and for our program then becomes the basis of it. So let me talk a little bit about kind of what it comes out of. And I think, as an historian, that one more sense of the extent of it. This is from the Encyclopedia of the Holocaust. You know, as I said, there's this huge literature on documenting what happened during the Holocaust, and lots of encyclopedias. There's one called Encyclopedia of the Holocaust that chronicles how 2/3 of Europe's Jews were killed. That, for example, in the Baltic states, in Latvia, Lithuania, Baltic. So,
Estonia.
Yes, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. In Lithuania, 90% of Jews there were killed, 143,000. In the Netherlands, 100,000, which was 70%. In Poland, because that's where most of these extermination centers were, 90% of the Jews in Poland were killed. 90%. You know, that's that world that is now gone. It's erased. It doesn't exist anymore. 90% of the Polish Jews were killed. 3 million Jews. In France, 20%, 77,000, 20%. Germany, 140,000, 25%, which is a little misleading, probably because a lot of Germans left. Many of them went west to be picked up later in France and other places. Greece, 90% of Greek Jews were killed. Soviet Union, which had a huge number, a third, but it was more than 1 million Jews killed in the Soviet Union. So, you know, these numbers are just extraordinary, and to have this documentation then of where. Soviet Union, 1 million. 1 million, and it was 30% of Jews. 30%. 36% actually, of a third. So these are all taken, these figures are taken from this Encyclopedia of the Holocaust. And you can see also the Yad Vashem, which is a museum archive in Jerusalem, also has a website with a lot of information on it. Another good website is the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And there are also many charts and maps, links to many other resources. So there's a lot out there to tell the story, you know, to find out what happened, which is the first step that has to be done. Background. As I said, as an historian, to me, these things don't happen out of context. You know, there has to be an historic context to it. Now, you know, it certainly is true that there are some times when the victims, mostly victims in genocides, are groups of long-standing enmity. You know, there usually has been a very long-standing history of a particular group which has been scapegoated, which has been othered, which has been seen as different. But that's not always the case when I think about Cambodia. Cambodia, yes, you had groups, the Muslims, the Vietnamese, groups that were 100% eradicated in the Pol Pot period, 1975 to 79. So those were groups where there had been historic enmity. But in some cases, the groups that were considered to be the other in Cambodia were constructed. They were literally the decision at the moment by the rulers of which group, and it changed over time. In those 4 years, 75 to 79, the group that had to be exterminated changed, and was not necessarily the ones that were of long standing. But generally, you know, in almost every case that I can think of, there has been an historic division ethnic division, language, whatever it is, division. And the enmity against the Jews in Europe is of very, very, very long standing. And I would recommend, if you're interested in the history of this, there are lots of sources, but you can actually go online and again look at the website for the Holocaust Museum, U.S. Holocaust Museum, and also Yad Vashem, and look under the history of anti-Semitism. One of the core courses that everyone has to take in the program at Kean is history of anti-Semitism, because in order to understand the extent of the Holocaust, the ferocity of it, the barbarity of it, the industrial nature of it, using all of the industrial mechanized versions in modern times that one could use, including this very high-tech way of killing, the numbers of people that needed to be killed, and then as the final solution from 41 to 45, Hitler, in terms of the final solution of being able to kill all the Jews, had to do it quickly. He had many, many Jews in camps, and he had to do it quickly, and so you had this extremely industrialized, all the best minds of Germany were put to figuring out how you can kill masses of people quickly. This came out of a enmity against Jews in Europe. And the extent of it, the depth of it is really quite extraordinary. Throughout European history, and we can go back to Greece and Rome, we can go back to classical times. Plutarch, you name it in European history, and there have been, and those people have been anti-Semitic and against the Jews. The Jews have stood for the other for thousands of years in Europe. Plutarch wrote against the Jews. Roman emperors expelled Jews from Rome. In 132 CE, the beginning of Jews being sent outside of their homeland. The Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed. 132 AD, yes. And one of the reasons, in fact, that you have later on, this has been speculated, one of the reasons there's so much antipathy towards the Jews is they were seen as people who didn't have a homeland. And that God was punishing them for some reason. There was some reason, had to be some reason why there was no homeland for them. And that's another reason given for gypsies, who were also a target of Hitler in the Holocaust, and are also the target, if you want to talk about contemporary genocide. You can make a strong argument that there are genocidal policies even now against gypsies in much of Europe. So this notion that these people who don't have a homeland, there's got to be a reason for it, that they have a mark on them, and so they are clearly othered, and if not by people, then by God. So this notion of the Jews not having a homeland really comes from 132 BC when they are driven out. It starts of the Jewish diaspora, comes from that period, and so Jews are wandering forever. The Roman Emperor becoming Christian did not save the Jews at all. In fact, Constantine, the first emperor who converted, one of the things he did when he converted to Christianity was he expelled Jews. It continues, whether it's classical times, whether it's Roman times, whether it is the early church, medieval times. Usually when European Christians went out on crusades, when they left their hometowns in Germany, in France, and went on a crusade, what they do first before they to start out was there were usually campaigns, pogroms, mass killings against the Jews. And the first crusade started that way. Almost all the crusades had a kind of a homegrown exercise at the start of it, which was against an enemy that everyone regarded as someone who was other, was okay. So before you went out to the Holy Lands to try to rescue them, you first did it at home against the Jews. every king of France, practically, from in ancient times into the 20th century, expelled Jews. So this expulsion of Jews or restricting Jews, preventing Jews from having professions, is European history, modern European history, ancient European history, medieval European history is filled. There's almost no year when you go through European history when there's not some place in Europe movement against the Jews. So this notion of Jews being different, of being people who are kind of outside and having qualities which made them clearly other is a very, very, very deep, long-standing. Not own land, most places. Eastern Europe, the Jews in Eastern European villages were not farmers, they could not be peasants, they could not own land. And so the professions that Jews could go into were professions which were craft making, were small shops, were merchant, were finance. And so that also emphasized the Jews being different. They did not come from the land, but they were money lenders. I mean, if you think about Shakespeare and Shylock and the image of Jews. Yeah, the image of the Jew. I mean, the image of the Jews comes out of their being prevented from going into other kinds of professions. And so this enmity, as I said, was of long standing. And so when you add to that then, so the historian in me then adds to that 19th century eugenics, 19th century social Darwinism, 19th century notions of race, which are sorry?
Therefore, 1917.
Yes. Well, that's that brings us into all sorts of other issues in terms of imperialism and the Middle East. But this notion that Jews were different because they were a different race, and so racial thinking then works perfectly with explaining why Jews are different. It's very clear they are a different race, and so racial thinking, a notion that some races are more advanced than others, finds its total expression then in Hitler and his argument that the Aryan race was the dominant, was the most progressive, most modern race, and that other races were inferior. And you add to that the antipathy. So not only were Jews an inferior race, but they were a race that had to be eliminated. Two other things that happen to explain, I don't think you think about the Holocaust, the extermination of the Jews without thinking about the rise of Hitler. And so two other things which explain the rise of Hitler is the World War I, which we are now for the next 4 or 5 years are going to be looking at World War I. So World War I and its industrial nature of World War I. It was an industrial war where the notion that you could solve everything by technology was demonstrated to be false, and so a great questioning of the Enlightenment ideas and progress. But World War I, then in its completion and trying to find the causes of World War I, blamed the Germans. And so the Germans came out of the Treaty of Versailles, came out of the ending of that war, being blamed, not only being blamed, but having chunks of land taken from them. The Ruhr Valley, the Alsace-Lorraine, which had resources, and so contested always between France and Germany. So a big chunk of land that was important was taken from Germany. Germany was given high indemnities, had to pay. So there is that humiliation of Germany. And then on top of all of that was depression. And so the Great World Depression of 1929, early 1930s. So for Hitler to come to power in 1933 as chancellor, and then and being appointed chancellor in 33, but voted Then 33, 34, 35, 36, this was not something that was imposed on the Germans. The Germans chose this, but the reason they chose it was because Hitler spoke to the national humiliation, spoke to their concerns, the economic concerns that the Germans under dire straits after World War I, and then having been hit by this world depression. And so what a better environment then to look for who's responsible for it. And to see that the Jews then are yet again, a very convenient target, and for Jews who, because of the Judeo-Christian Islamic history of the book, if you can't be a worker, if you can't be a peasant, what did Jews excel in? It was in these other, in merchants, but also in education. Just as in all of this tradition from the book, what is it that is really privileged? It is the person who studies the book, studies the Torah, the Talmudic scholar, has the highest respect in the culture. So Jews were much more predominant in universities, in certain professions, in the legal profession, medical profession. And so again, these are all targets for previous people who were anti-Semitic, trying to restrict Jews, but also prime targets then for Hitler and the Germans, who decided that in order to purify.
How it is possible for Hitler to exterminate Jews? So mass people support Hitler to exterminate Jewish people or soldier. So we can blame all Germany, not Hitler, for this extermination.
Absolutely. And so in 1933 is a really extraordinary moment, and you can look, again, I recommend timelines that come along with the Holocaust Museum, with Yad Vashem. But 1933, Hitler is chancellor, and immediately in 1933, moves against the Jews. And 1934, 35, Nuremberg laws stripping Jews of property, barring them from professions. And you actually have, from 1933 on, I think Dachau, the prime work camp that's in Germany, I think is established in 1933. So at the beginning, the notion is of separating out the Jews, moving them to certain parts of towns, ghettoizing them. Jews, this was not new. The first ghettos, residential restricted limit places in Europe were 16th century in Venice, in Italy. So this was not a new notion, but Hitler's plan was to first move Jews into a restricted part of cities in Germany, and then in the other parts of Europe that the Germans took over. One of the first things that was done was putting Jews into ghettos. And then the idea was, once they were in ghettos, then to move them from the ghettos to work camps. And initially the idea was to use their labor, because you needed, this war machine. Germany had this extraordinary war machine, to have this war machine that could conquer the world, and much labor was used for that. And so the initial idea was to use Jews' bodies for labor and work them to death in these labor camps, killing those people who were not productive. But as the war progressed, and more Jews were brought from other parts of Europe, not really to Germany, but brought to Poland. And so if you look at the maps of where the camps were, most of them were in Poland, or in Eastern Europe. Labor camps, certainly ghettos there, labor camps, and then beginning in the 1940s, extermination camps. So the big camps that people know about, Dachau is a labor camp. Auschwitz was the number one, more than 1 million people in Auschwitz at a time. It was the end of a railroad spur. So it's where the train roads ended. And from 1941 on, when the final solution was decided. This is the time then when Jews were brought from all over Europe to Eastern Europe, to Poland, to be exterminated in this industrial fashion. And the development there then of techniques of mass killing, which had been first of all by shooting them, and then this industrial technique of figuring out, and as I said, the best minds of Europe, of Germany, focusing on how you could best do this, what kind of gas in the gas chamber. Initially, there were not gas chambers. Initially, they were putting people in vans, in large trucks, in enclosed vans. And that was first experimented with. And then this notion of having a site at the camp and a particular kind of gas which would kill people quickly, and then mass burial. But when the mass burial was, when there were too many bodies, then the notion of actually burning the bodies and the crematorium. So this enormous capacity then to get rid of as many as possible, and which was by 1944 speeded up because all these Jews which had been rounded up from all over Europe had to be exterminated as the Russian army is coming, as the Allied forces are bearing down on Germany. This speed up then of trying to kill all the Jews took place. So this is this is kind of the outline of the genocide, the unique genocide, which is called the Holocaust. Just 2 minutes, and then I want to open up and talk with you about the Holocaust, other genocides as well. But what we're left with, and this is the discussions I'm having here in Bangladesh, I have in Cambodia, I have in Nanjing, is what you do afterwards. So yes, we need to document what happens. The question is what to do afterwards. And the first thing, and people who are studying Holocaust, genocide, there are 3 goals, steps that we emphasize in the literature. And the first one is truth. First is to get out the truth. And that I see at the Liberation War Museum in its great detail, is saying, what was it that happened? Let's see if we can find out the facts. That's what we do when we do the testimonials, when people tell their stories, is to find out what exactly happened. And also, and I understand that you have a course in this, there's a lot of work being done now on psychology of perpetrators, psychology of victims, psychology of bystanders, witnesses. But one of the things that people talk about for the victims or the survivors who can tell the stories is that with trauma, when you have something which is so traumatic, which ruptures you, as traumatic as something which comes, there's nothing like it in one's life, it ruptures what happened before from what happens afterwards, is that it emphasizes what happens is people then need to tell the stories. So this notion that you have to repeat, you have to tell the story, and you have to let people know, you have to tell the story over and over again. And so trauma is really an important part of that process, and it comes out of the experience. So telling the truth, getting it out. And one of the things that happens along with this memory making, truth telling, making of history, and these are goals which have some conflict. History and memory are not the same thing. A lot of historians now are working on issues of history and memory, and they oftentimes are in conflict. But one of the things that comes along with telling the stories is memorializing the place. And I see that here as well. And I look forward to going to other places around this university, the actual sites where things happen. And so one of the big issues in European history is trying to understand what you do with the sites where this mass killing, this unprecedented kind of mass killing happened. And there we have to figure out who makes the decisions. Whose history is this? Who tells the story? Who controls the history? Who owns the history? And so in the history of the Holocaust, when it's talking about memory sites, the killing fields, how to remember them, how to maintain them, how to commemorate them.
What is the major difference between Holocaust and genocide? Sometimes I get twist to understand.
Well, that's a good question. But in deciding about these memory sites, the extermination camps, where things actually were done, usually the decisions about that have been done with committees that are mixed committees of survivors, of officials, of academics studying it, architects. So the notion of how you commemorate the sites, what you do with the buildings, what you do with the barracks, what you do with the dorms, where things happen. So how you go about commemorating that in a way that is educational, is respectful. Do you let the barracks, do you let these places run down? Then they are gone and you don't see the sites anymore. Do you build them up? Then they're no longer the place that they were. The most visited site in Germany is Dhaka. It's in Germany. It was not an extermination camp. It did not have ovens. It did not have crematoria. It wasn't even actually a place where most Jews went. It was one that had POW soldiers, who had political prisoners, who had other people. And Dachau was falling into ruin when people decided to make it into a memorial site. And so it was cleaned up. It has fresh gravel, white gravel. It has freshly painted buildings. It's very peaceful. And people who go there are oftentimes shocked because they say, this doesn't look like a place where this kind of working people to death happened. And that's always a question. How do you keep the sites, maintain the sites? People want to go to them, but how do you maintain them? So this notion of memorializing is really a challenging one. And there are some of the sites, Auschwitz actually has done it really quite well, but again, it took years in deciding how to do it. Also, it was in Eastern Germany. And so the Soviets, whose story is it? Well, the Soviets had their own story because it was a site where many communists were killed. And so when they tell that, when the Soviets controlling Eastern Germany told the story, they told about it as the Jews were only part of the story. It was really about it was really a political issue. It was really the killing of the communists that happened there, along with the Jews. So after 1989, the story changes with the fall of the Soviet Union. And so Auschwitz is very interesting because this was an extermination site. This was a site that had crematoria, and so what they have done is, after enormous amount of discussion about it, there is the crematoria are still there, and there's a railroad track. The notion is the symbol of it is the track that brought people in cattle cars to the site and then to their death. But the discussion about who owns this site, and there were plaques there describing who the victims were. The plaques now are empty. After 1989, they were erased because the language of it was the language of the Soviet Union and was political. And so they're now, also because the survivors are no longer alive. I mean, this is an issue every place that you have to deal with, is what happens when the survivors are no longer there. And survivors are no longer part of the voice to to decide what to put on those plaques. And so you go to Auschwitz and you see the plaques describing it. There's no label. There's no label. There aren't words yet that are agreed upon to describe this site. So there are these memorial sites. That's an important part of the memorializing, memory making, trying to get at truth. Two other steps, if you will, that we talk about. One is not just memorializing, but truth, getting at truth. The second one is getting at justice. So concomitant with the idea of finding out what happens is what can be done about it. And the first thing to be done about it is who's responsible, and making sure those people who are responsible for it are punished, or that their guilt is acknowledged. And so exactly how one does that is very complicated, and it's certainly one that has been a challenge for any place that has gone through genocide, is to figure out how to find out who the perpetrators were, how to bring them to justice, how to satisfy this very important need for justice. There's a third step, which is very rare, and some people say is not possible. Certainly many people who are involved in Holocaust studies say cannot be done, and that's one of reconciliation, closure, forgiveness, and one which is, as I said, is very difficult to even contemplate. And I think that certainly those people who went through the Holocaust, either the survivors of it, or now, as in many places what you're getting, because people don't necessarily talk about these things immediately. My experience with the Bangladeshi people in New Jersey, it takes decades sometimes for people to feel comfortable with talking about things, is that, you can only begin to really talk about things, to get things out, to talk about having reconciliation, having any kind of closure, to having any kind of forgiveness, is very difficult for the survivors and then for the next generation. And so what you're finding with the Holocaust now, that there is this notion of kind of generational witnessing, generational passing on of trauma, generational passing on of stories. This is a field where people who are psychologists, this is a new field really, trauma studies, where people are talking about generational transmission of trauma. And not only first generation, but there's a person I know who's working on Indonesia, 1965, the genocides in Indonesia, 1965, and talking about the grandchildren of the victims of 1965, exhibiting symptoms of trauma, that this is transmitted in families. And so how then is that addressed, dealt with, and is there any kind of reconciliation, closure, forgiveness possible if you move to that? My colleague who runs this program actually is involved in this kind of combination of psychology, history, legal studies, et cetera, where he argues actually that you can have forgiveness even without apologies, even without somebody saying they're sorry. That's a very controversial argument. And he's kind of alone almost in making that argument, that he feels that to do the next step, to move on, they have to do it now. Many people dealing with the Holocaust say there is no closure possible. That once you have this break, this kind of barbarity, this kind of behavior which is beyond what humans should do, that there's no closure possible. You can't do it. And that's a very contentious area of genocide, Holocaust studies. Just one, two images, which I showed people yesterday. Two images, which I showed because I think that one feels compelled to tell the stories, to do something with them, to if there's anything that we do, if there's anything grounds these programs that we have, both here and in New Jersey, New York, is that we all hope that this does not happen again. That the kinds of things that happened in Bangladesh in 1971, in Indonesia in 1965, in Nanjing in 1937, that we all hope that they, pray that they will not happen again. How can we ensure that they don't happen again? And so that's why we study them. That's why we learn about them. That's why we have museums dedicated to them. That's why we have archives. It's to document it, but it's also to hopefully prevent. And there are two images that come to my mind in terms of just a tiny, tiny glimmer now. Many survivors, people would say, it's too small. There's not really a glimmer, but to me there is a little bit of a glimmer. And one of them is what I witnessed in Cambodia. The trials in Cambodia are online. There's a documentation center in Cambodia, the DCC, and you can actually real-time watch the tribunal going on in Cambodia. The Cambodian tribunal each one has been different. It's different from the Bangladeshi one, different from others. And one of the things that they did was they allowed people to, fourth-party people to testify, and they had 8,000 applicants for this. There, differently in Bangladesh, what they had was actually people who made the policy. So there are only probably going to be 2 people who will be convicted in Cambodia out of all the people who made the policy and put it in effect. Maybe 2 people convicted, but the interest in the trials in Cambodia is so extreme that there are lines and lines and lines, hours, people wait in line hours to get in and watch the proceedings. And inside the proceedings, what they're able to see is the people who are the survivors, the children of those who somehow they were affected. There's an application form to be a witness. And they are actually, in this proceeding, able to go and confront trial. I mean, literally come within inches of them and to say, hear my story, this is what happened, why did you do this, tell me, this is what you did, this is what my family suffered, and to be able to physically see that person and to rage at them. And so that has been extraordinarily important in Cambodian culture too, and I sat in that courtroom and watched that happen. And the process of it has been enormously important in Cambodia. The second image, and this is one in Japan, in the 2 sites in Hiroshima. And I, am moved about this as an American who, certainly students in my class argue that the dropping of an atomic bomb, where we knew what kind of devastation, didn't know the extent of it, but we knew the kind of devastation that it could cause. The dropping of an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and then certainly the second one, Nagasaki, you could argue were genocidal. You could argue. And so I went to Ground Zero in Hiroshima, which was really, it was built as a monument to, and there's a museum, Hiroshima Museum, built as a monument to the agony, the pain, the barbarity of that action. But yet, in the middle of this park, in Ground Zero, there's only one building that was standing. In the middle of this park, there is a profusion of banners that were made. And the banners come out of it. It's a children's book. There was a girl who was dying of atomic bomb sickness. And there's a children's book called Hideko and 1,000 Cranes. The idea that if she made 1,000 origami cranes, that she would not die. And so she died before she could finish them, but people around the world learned about her story and made 1,000 cranes. This is something which no Japanese government, no one had any idea would happen. It really came from the ground up, came from people around the world. Japanese school children coming, everybody bringing these long strings of origami cranes. It was very, very moving for me to see this thing which has not been planned, which has been kind of developing. And you go to this Ground Zero and you see in the wind these hundreds and thousands of origami banners of people saying, this is what happened, and the South American case, the words are in Spanish, nunca más, never again. And there seems to be just a small glimmer of hope, but I know I cried when I came there. It was extraordinarily moving to see this kind of expression that comes, from people hoping that it not happen again. So thank you.
So America did the same thing as Japan did in 1941, attack Pearl Harbor. So why America take lesson from attacking Pearl Harbor? America did the same thing, and America invaded Iraq, Afghanistan, following 2003 and 2006. This is the mass killing, or not? What is your idea? But what do you think about it?
Unfortunately, Americans, the Americans tend to equate Pearl Harbor with the atomic bomb and tend to see them as equal. They did it to us in 41, so we can do it to them in 45. I think that's absolutely faulty reasoning, and because of the what was known about the atomic bomb. But it was warfare. It was a kind of the most extreme form of modern industrial warfare was the atomic bomb that was developed. And once you begin developing a weapon, it has its own momentum. You have to use it. The other thing, as an historian, I don't see it as only about that. It has to be seen in a broader context. It was the first salvo of the Cold War. The atomic bomb really had not that much to do with the Japanese, I feel. It was really saying to the Soviet Union, look what we can do. So there are multiple reasons for those kinds of things. But it was about American power and Cold War. That was a Cold War moment. Yes. Question? So
but this is
yes.
not easy to understand. Why in Soviet Union Jews were killed? As because Politburo of Soviet Union Communist Party, out of 10 or 11 members, out of 10 or 11 members, 4 were Jews. Even Trotsky were Jews.
I'm sorry, I don't get.
Trotsky,
Russian
Communist, Soviet Communist Party, Politburo member was 11 or 12 like this. But out of 12 were in Soviet Union, how you can adjust this portion?
Well, no, but anti-Semitism runs deep in European Eurasian history. So in the Soviet Union, although they didn't kill the Jews to the extent that, and didn't ship them out to the extent that other people did, Stalin was very anti-Semitic, and the Doctor's Plot. There were lots of Jews who were Bolsheviks, right? So this was a absolutely. So there were many Jews who were leftists, who were supportive, and Jews who were very revolutionary in Russia. But there you have to go back, I think, to the history, that the notion of Jews not being trusted, that if times get bad and you have to look for a scapegoat, the Jews are very convenient. And so Stalin, in the 1950s, there was a Doctor's Plot where he killed those around him, and they were mostly Jews. So there you have to, I think, go to the role Jews played. Yes, but there I think you have to go to the role that Jews played, in this long history, for millennia, of being convenient outsiders, homeless, and privileged in some ways financially, so there was a good target in terms of those people who were there running financial institutions, whatever. But it's a convenient target.
I have a question actually.
Sure.
What we learned that in Holocaust, 11 million people were killed. So, and 6 million were
Yes.
Jews. But how actually they calculate this figure that 11 million was killed? How actually after the Holocaust, who actually, what is the process actually? Because
it's very complicated.
In our country there is a big
Numbers are always important. Numbers are always important, and so much time and space is spent on deciding numbers. and I'll talk about the numbers for Germany in just a minute, but the study of the Nanjing massacre, 1937, two sides of the sea. When you go to the memorial in Nanjing, big letters, 300,000 the Chinese proclaim were killed there, 300,000. And it's that is what you see when you see the Memorial Museum. In Japan, there are very respected scholars, very conservative scholars, respected, who've done studies of it, and the most extreme, and they're called illusionists. There are three different groups of historians of Nanjing in Japan, and one group is called the illusionists. And there is one scholar who says there were only 50 people who were killed in Nanjing. And he said, the way he does it, he says, well, Nanjing, it's a big city, it's a big area, so it's actually, you're only talking about the central part of Nanjing. So it's only Nanjing city. And it's only late December, only 2 weeks. So you limit geography, you limit the time, and there's only 50 people. The rest of them were soldiers, but it's only 50 people who are innocent people who were killed. So between 50 and 300,000. So oftentimes the debate centers on numbers. There's this fetish almost for numbers. Most scholars feel in Nanjing that it was not 300,000, maybe 200,000. This is now how many years after the Holocaust? 40 after 45. But there now have been, I think whether it's Nanjing or or the Holocaust, very, very hardworking scholars looking at numbers. They're helped in a bit by a kind of a fascination, and you find this with many genocides, is there's almost a fascination with documenting. So the Germans, documented. People with their numbers, right? They had the numbers that were tattooed. So their numbers, the counting, and so the architects of the plans, would document how many people came in each train car, how many people were. So there's a lot of documentation actually on the site. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, the architects of that mass killing in Cambodia, they documented. You go to the Tolslung, to the place where 20,000 of the most suspect people were in the prison in Phnom Penh, and every single one of those 20,000 has a picture, and the pictures are there, and every single one of them had to do confessions. And there's a second floor of that prison with the confessions. And they're kept, and there's a number, and you can follow. So the people who do the genocide oftentimes, this almost makes you think of psychology, right? That there's almost this obsession with documenting the numbers. So these numbers that we have, I think, from European history, I think, as an historian, I think now they're really very fine-tuned. And they're larger numbers than any would have thought. This notion of the number of killing sites. So I think this shocked all the scholars. And now, as I said, now there are other kinds of evidence that historians can use. GPS. So there's a whole field now of people doing kind of geography to help look for graves, and that has advanced the understanding in many parts of the world of the extent of killing. In South America, it's used a lot. In China, and there are more sites. One of the reasons you can argue that the killing of Chinese by the Japanese in World War II was genocidal was all of the sites where Chinese were killed and mass burials, which you can see now using satellite, other kinds of techniques. So the numbers game is important, but there, as with everything else, as an historian, I say, we have techniques for, looking at this evidence.
1948, so they start killing all the Palestinian people, the general people. So what's the benefit? Hitler assassinated or exterminated Jewish people, but they start killing of the Palestinian people at the same way. So what's the lesson of the history?
How do you view the recent
these are very complicated stories, right? The view is, right, that Jews were expelled from their homeland, 132 CE, that Jews were expelled. They had a homeland, they were expelled from it, from their rightful place. And so if they are so unwanted in Europe and they are eliminated, as I said, much of the European world of the Jews is gone, then where to go? And many, went North America, South America, so about half of Jews in the world live in North America, South America. Although North America, South America did not want Jews who tried to get out of Germany, of Hitler's Germany, most of the world said no. In the early 1940s, there were 30-some countries that said absolutely not. You can't come here. But many after the war went to North and South America. And then in looking for a place, now remember, I didn't actually mention this in terms of my timeline. Remember when Jews tried to go back to their homes in Europe, when Jews went back to their homes in Germany, when they went back to their homes in Poland, when those enormous numbers, those who survived and could get back to their homes in Poland, there were pogroms, mass killings, after 1945. I mean, there's a huge pogrom in Poland in 1946, after the war, after people learned about the concentration camps and the extermination camps and learned about Germany. So 1946, 47, Polish people were not happy to have Jews come back. They did not welcome them back. Why not? They had their homes, they had their property. There was no place for the Jews to go except places that now Poles lived in. And there's a whole lot of anti-Semitism in Poland. There always was. So the Polish people talk about themselves as victims of Hitler, which they were, but they also were victimizing the Jews. So there literally was no place for Jews to go. Even those that survived could not go back home. This did not just happen in Poland. Jews who went back to France, their homes, their belongings, their properties had been confiscated, had been given to people, had been taken over by their neighbors. And so I'm certainly not saying that and defending all that Israel has done. Please don't misunderstand me. But it is a conundrum to say, what is it? And the Polish government did not do anything in 1946 when these pogroms happened against Jews, who went back and said, this is my house, I want my house back. There were waves of violence against Jews way past 1945 in Europe as they tried to reclaim what they'd had. So, it did cry out for some kind of international solution. And unfortunately, not all the voices were in that solution. Not all the voices were listened to. But there you have, legacy of imperialism, etc. Many other issues. But I think the story of Jews going back home, that's also a fairly new story. If you're interested in reading, the best person who's written about this in very moving terms, Jan Gross, Jan-Gross. And what he does is it's very extraordinary stories because he takes like one village. Oftentimes the best way to tell the story is to tell the story of one place. And so he tells the story of one village where Jews tried to come back and the violence against them as they tried to come back after 1945. And so it's, imagine that you've been, and many Jews who ended up in those extermination camps when they were, those who survived, when they told their story, they oftentimes had been moved. They'd been moved from their village to another village. And this is what the Nazis were doing as they were rounding people up and moving towards the final solution, was people moved. So they had to move out of their city place to a ghetto from one village to another village to a work camp, to another work camp, and then maybe to an extermination camp. So oftentimes they had 5 or 6 transfers in their lives. Maybe they had escaped, maybe they went, west, and then the French delivered them to the Germans. But many people had multiple transfers. And so then to be able to survive a work camp, a concentration camp, extermination camp, and then to say, okay, good, I can go home, and to see that your home is no longer yours and belongs to, your neighbor, who says, oh, this is mine now, you can't have it. Judea as their homeland is certainly understandable. As with many things in history, though, is not done with sensitivity to all the people who were involved in it. Other questions, other comments?
Why they give so much emphasis in mythological story? Is there any reality in that mythological story? 12 lost tribes, they are in India sometimes.
Yes, right, of course.
How
Right.
do you know how much their research is old civilization? We know so much about this thing. Even you see in Eastern India, Nagaland or Tripura, Nagaland or Manipur, there are 7,000 to 7,500 people, tribal people. The Israeli people come here to Trapeze. They are the descendants of our people. And they took these people in Israel. And they are now settlers in Israel. So how it was a reality in 2000 years back in Nagaland or Nagaland or Manipur that they are descendant people? How? We cannot understand what they are thinking like this.
I mean, why people would banish them, or why they would travel?
How they find out that this tribal people was a lost descendant of that tribal, 12 lost tribes or something like that?
Right. Well, I mean,
it's not mythology. That is a culture.
No. Well, now, except now we have DNA. There are ways to test this. I mean, look at the DNA testing has been very interesting. Look at in Africa. Where is it, Mozambique? There are, and actually Israel's had to deal with people coming from parts of the world that they had no idea where there would be Jews asking for a homeland when they said, okay, all your Jews come back, you have your homeland, and they had no idea how far the dispersal had gone. And using DNA, people could say, okay, I may appear to be African, but if you look at my DNA, I am of Jewish background, and then claim that they should be allowed. And Israel's had to deal with many people from certainly North Africans, lots of North Africans, but even sub-Saharan Africans have been able to prove, through DNA that they were Jewish and can claim to be admitted into Israel.
But Jews claim they are Semitic people. But how often?
But these are very different stories, right? The Rwanda story and the Holocaust. I mean, they're both clearly genocides. The Rwanda case is interesting in that it's not on a spectrum in terms of modern industrial. We talk about one of the marks of genocide is that it's modern, and this is part of the definition that Lemkin came up with to base the convention, the UN convention on, and that it had to be done by a state, had to have intent, and was modern. That there's something that you can do in modern times you couldn't do before. And certainly Hitler is the most extreme part of that industrial modern technology. Rwanda is not, right? I mean, Rwanda was not done with modern technology. Rwanda was done with machetes, with with very primitive kinds of. Absolutely, and still was absolutely, and still in the space of only a few weeks. And the Rwanda case, if you've read, Samantha Power is one of the people who has written a lot about this. That by the time the world said, "Oh, something's going on," it was done. So is the ferocity. The Rwanda case actually brings in another issue which we haven't talked about so much, and that is the whole imperialism, and the differences that are there, and there are some, racial differences, but many of those differences were constructed and, were used by imperialist powers to advance empire. So that's every genocide is different. Every genocide is similar in some way. Every genocide is different in its own way. So looking at it comparatively, which is what you've done in this course, I think is really important because it brings out both the similarities, the awful similarities, and the differences on the margins.
Could you go back to the earlier question on why is Holocaust and genocide the two concepts?
I just mentioned.
It's a special genocide. It's unique. There are some other cases. The genocide against the Ukrainians has its own term also, the Holodomor. So and this is another controversial one, which some people would say isn't genocide, but the deaths of Ukrainians in the 1930s by starvation, by Stalin. And that genocide, that alleged genocide, has also been given its own name by Ukrainians. So this notion of giving it a special name is not only true of Jews. The argument is that the extent of it, the fact that it was 6 million, and then 12 million if you add gypsies, homosexuals, disabled, elderly, Jehovah's Witnesses, the other 5-6 million, that it was the size, it was the ferocity, but it's the systemic industrial nature of it that Hitler determined to get rid of, and did in fact exterminate this many people.
And also,
was there any reaction from German intellectual in that time?
This is a very complicated story. It's a very complicated story. So, many people say it was Hitler. It's only Hitler. Hitler was the madman. And this is the debate. And one of the things actually last year, this opened it up again. When the maps came out of where those camps, extermination centers, ghettos, that there were 40,000 of them, it became almost impossible for Germans to say they didn't know it. When you could say, oh, it was over there in Poland someplace, I didn't know it. But when you found out that it was right next door to you that there was a killing center, it was no longer possible for people to say, oh, I didn't know it was happening. And so the implication, there's an author, Daniel Goldhagen, who wrote a book about the guilt of all Germans. He said all Germans are responsible. You could not have lived in Germany and not have known about it. I just saw a movie about the Indonesian killing. There was one. It was an Oscar award winner called The Act of Killing, and a very, very fine documentary photographer, filmmaker, Joshua Oppenheimer, went to a village in Indonesia, and he spoke to the people who had been involved in the killing in 1965 of communists. It was the argument given for killing people. Cold War was the context. And first of all, many people said, they didn't know about it. They didn't know about it. He found some people who were willing to talk about it and were willing to actually on camera say, well, we did this, here's how we killed people. But when people went back, and they said, well, he said it, but we didn't know anything about it. But it was your brother, it was your sister who did it. It was done in your village. Everybody heard about it. You could hear the persons crying. They said, oh, no, we didn't know about it. So the extent of people, even those involved, to deny, to forget. To forget. Both people who go through it with trauma forget, don't want to talk about it. Remembering and forgetting exist at the same time in talking in studies of Holocaust genocide.
Well, in terms of the communist countries like China, Russia, So Lenin is the panic icon from the young generation. Mao Zedong in China, but they have killed 1,100 people. So why they come the hero or national hero right now for China, for Lenin, Robespierre, the French Revolution, but they are the hero. But Western media say they are the villain or the killer or extremist. So why these things is occurring or happening? But sometimes I get twist to understand this.
When in Europe after World War II and when the extent of the Holocaust you could not deny, when it was clear that there were extermination centers, it was clear that there was this industrial desire to exterminate and that Hitler had almost done that. As the truth of that really sunk in, the notion of not having this happen again, became worldwide. Human rights, language had developed, and so you have these conventions by the International Party, the UN, that to try to prevent genocide by being able to name it and to then identify it and do something with those people who had perpetrated it. And so there are certain kinds of, when you look at the convention, there are certain kinds of qualifications, something like factors that are part of that definition. And so you have the state. We usually talk about the state or a large political authority. An important part, and this again is quite controversial and is being challenged now, precisely for those reasons, one of the kind of qualifications for something to be a genocide is for there to be intent. There should be a plan, a systematic plan by a state to do it. The argument, and I'm not saying how I feel about it, but the argument is for China, for many of the policies of the Soviet Union, certainly in Ukraine is one of the arguments, but certainly for China, certainly for the Great Leap Forward from 58 to 62, when the latest figure is a fellow Dikotter, Dikotter, who has been writing about this for a while. And his latest figure is that there were 45 million people who died between 1958 and 1962 in China. As China pushed modernization, they were going to surpass Britain in 15 years, et cetera. Into these large communes, made everybody make steel in the countryside all over. And that combined with famine, drought, natural causes as well, meant that there were people who died in large numbers. People could not, also under Mao, people could not travel. So you had to stay in your village. And so traditionally people, if there's a famine, you move. You go someplace else. And so there were a lot of, it was the terrible convergence of a lot of factors. And the argument is that this was not intentional. It came as a result of policies that were attempting to propel China into modern times, but badly thought out policies. So intent is not there, is the argument. There are people who argue that these are genocidal because the desire was to have as many signers as possible on this convention at the UN. And you wanted to have a broad consensus around the world. There were certain kinds of alleged genocides that were not included. And the term that's used for what was happening under Stalin, under Mao, was politicide. That these were the result of political decisions and political policies. They were not intentional, but they were the result of deciding that a particular political group had to be determined, had to be eliminated. And for all sorts of political reasons, those potential genocides were not included. And the notion of political genocide was not included in the convention. So there are all these other kind of genocides now that, so in the field we talk about politicide, we talk about, or democide sometimes, we talk about gendercide. There's a whole field of argument that, that there are policies that result in the elimination of, usually women in this case, things like selective abortions. So things that not in this generation, but maybe in next generations, that there are acts that of mass killing or mass prevention of living that would be a kind of genocide. So there are many different ways that genocide has now been argued. Sure. Be able to tell the Bangladeshi story. It's not well known. It's not well known. It's not well known. South Asian history is not well known in the United States, in Europe, and my students don't know about partition. So we were talking today. I really see 71 as part of 47. To me, that's the long partition. There's a recent book on it. I see myself as really telling the stories around the world that there were genocides. When I teach my course on genocide in Asia, people say, well, there was a genocide in Cambodia, but there were other genocides in Asia. They say, unfortunately, there's no part of the world, which is immune from this terrible way of treating other people, or treating one's own people, really. So I include Bangladesh as one of the genocides that I include in my course, and because we had this extraordinary conference, and it was all, I should tell you, it was all taped, and so you can actually go on YouTube and you can find it, and there are tapes of it that you can find on the internet because the whole conference was taped. And so it's something that I do in my courses, and there's been more and more knowledge of it, but I think it comes with really just a general people learning about South Asia. It clearly was genocidal, there's no question I have, and I include it in my class. I have to tell you that my approach in my class, the way that I teach, is that I have students do the reading on defining genocide. And so the first task for students in my class is to come up with all of these competing definitions, come up with their own definition of it, and then I present possible cases of it. And they have to go through the process. I mean, I kind of model it. We look at one genocide as a model. And then they have to come up with their own conclusions, and then we do that as a class about whether they think that a particular case is genocidal or not, according to these factors that we've identified and talked about. I can't think of any time I've taught this class now, 3 or 4 times, and I think every time I've taught it, the conclusion in the class is that Bangladesh was genocide.
Very near
Yes.
to Holocaust. I
Yes.
say this because in Bengali, the word that we use is gonohatta, and gonohatta comes close to mass killing. Okay, and that creates problem because gonohatta is a mass killing. So people say, what's so special about genocide? And I think the word is intentional killing. That's if the killing is intentional, then it becomes genocide. Because you can have gonohatta for other kind of killing, as would be the case of gonohatta in riot or in violence, in other violence, which may not be, where there can be a mass killing, but not necessarily genocide. Whereas all genocide probably will be mass killing. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
Actually, it depends on the scale of murder or scale of killing.
Not only the scale, I think the intention. I think that's the definition that the international community has agreed, that intent to kill.
It's not only intent to kill; it's intent to get rid of.
Get rid of. Yeah.
It's intent to exterminate.
It's exterminate also.
It's intent to get rid of a whole group.
Yeah.
Actually, the unit definition, it fudges it a bit. It says in whole or in part.
Whole or in
in
part,
whole and part.
right,
But,
exactly.
you know, the idea is that you have a group which you've identified as different, and then you want to
Yeah.
eventually get rid of them as a people, and including cultural. You know, so in settler, terrible terms, settler societies in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, North America, where you had you know, a superior power come in and take over a place. And many of the policies there were of erasing the culture. And so you have in Australia the notion of taking young children and raising them as white and getting rid of Aboriginal culture. And that's considered genocidal also.
The advent of the new technology is responsible for cultural genocide, cultural genocide. Substance of satellite, internet, etc. For example, something like that. This new
Well, you
technology.
could, I suppose. Yeah, and you know, there are many different ways, but of getting rid of the identity of a people. So erasing the people. Usually, you think of it in terms of their bodies, but there's an argument that there's cultural genocide, which is not just their bodies, but their whole identities in terms of.
Normally, actually, the majority people actually try to destroy the minority people in all of the genocide, like
Mhm.
in generally as well, right? Because the Jews are minority in there.
Yes.
Yeah. And Rwanda as well, the Hutus are majority and the Tutsis was minority.
But in the case of Pakistan, it would be the other way.
Well-
Minority trying to
Right.
get rid of majority.
Example of that.
Yeah.
It may not be. It may not be.
It may not be.
It's dominant. It may be the dominant
dominant.
people. It may not be most numbers.
Yeah.
Most numbers.
But I think the idea of cold murder and hot murder would be one way of looking at it. The cold murder, you know, this concept called, you know, you cold murders. You think
Right.
and then you murder. But then there can be hot murder, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that can be one way of seeing the distinction between what genocide concept is all about. Anyway, thank you. I think we learned a lot. I'm sure you have all benefited. And we'll hear our talk again, in fact, on genocide in Asia on the 14th. Hope all of you can come to the public lecture.
Yes.
No, that will be on the Senate. On the 16th, sorry.
We'll try.
Yeah, tomorrow. No, 16th.
Thursday.
On the 16th at 4 p.m. at Senate building, Senate building, and we can continue. If you have some of the other questions, definitely you can raise even then. Thank you, Sue, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you on behalf of students.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.